Millions of despairing men, women, and little children, victims of a system that makes men torture and imprison innocent people.
You cannot shake hands with a clenched fist.
Produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
We're not saying that planet Earth is coming to an end. We're saying that planet Earth is about to be refurbished, spaded under, and have another chance to serve as a garden for another civilization.
Most of the people in here are just your reflections. They're your mistakes.
1776 will commence again if you try to take our firearms.
1 million of the planet's 8 million species are threatened.
You are what you repeatedly do. Therefore, excellence ought to be a habit, not an act.
Your lives and the credibility of the United Nations is at stake.
Epstein didn't kill himself.
The reason this is such an interesting time is not only because we're on the threshold of the end of this civilization.
They're trying to take you out with bullshit.
The experience of the past 2 years has proven beyond doubt that no nation can appease the Nazis.
To those who can hear me, I say, do not despair. The misery that is now upon us is but the passing of greed, the bitterness of men who fear the way of human progress. The hate of men will pass, and dictators die, and the power they took from the people will return to the people. And so long as men die, liberty will never perish.
In the language of the U.S. Department of Defense, these are unidentified aerial phenomena.
Roswell's a very interesting place with a lot of people that would like to know what's going on.
There is very compelling evidence that we may not be alone.
This is the Garden of Doom.
Welcome everyone to Garden of Doom or Garden of Thoughts, whichever show you are looking for, you're in the right place. And we are joined this week by Professor number 3 in this 4-week series called The Parade of Professors. We're very happy to have a returning guest come back, and it's Professor Richard Spence. He's a retired professor, and I encountered him originally when he presented the great courses on Audible on the occult, and I reached out to him. He was kind enough to agree to come on the show, and now a second time as well. So thank you very much, Professor. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
Now, the pleasure is mine. It's my honor. And I guess if you want to tell the folks a little bit about yourself, if they didn't hear the first show, well, shame on them. But no, we always have new listeners, and that's great. So, a little bit on you.
Okay, so I'm Rick Spence. Again, I'm a Professor Emeritus, which is a fancy way of saying that I'm retired from the University of Idaho in Moscow, Idaho, murder capital of the Pacific Northwest.
Wow.
Northwest. Actually, it's a lovely place. There are occasional homicides, but, it's America. And, I've taught there for almost 35 years, retired in 2020. And since then, I've been busy, doing things like this, working on various other projects. I'm working on another project for the great courses called Villains of History, which is really just a kind of litany of bad guys and some bad gals. And, one of the things when you begin to look at villains, you find out that, some of them a few are actually worse than you assume they might have been.
Right.
But a lot of them, in some ways, come out was almost sympathetic. You really begin to see that a lot of what can turn someone into a bad guy in history is bad PR. So there you go. So that's one of the projects I'm working on. Also have my fingers in another possible video series about the influence of the occult on rock and roll. Who knew there was such a thing? And, projects dealing with J. Shelby Downard, a true American weirdo, Fred Chrisman, an arch-conspirator of one form or another, and other projects that, I'm not going to mention because I'll jinx them if they get any further than that. But retirement has been interesting and quite enjoyable because despite the fact that it's busy, every day is Saturday, which I like.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. I mean, the occult and rock and roll. I mean, I guess it sort of starts with the Beatles in the 60s, but
Exactly.
I mean, you're going to be, I mean, you know, it's usually not your retirement that you start listening to Black Sabbath and Iron Maiden. So now maybe you didn't start. Maybe, you know, we're probably generationally the similar in one degree. So maybe you were listening to it in their heyday. Maybe you're already there.
Yes, you know, I remember. Well, I should point out that the Rock and the Occult, which is the working title of that is Running with the Devil, is not. I'm a contributor to that, so I don't claim that it's mine, but I'm a contributor to it, and at least as things stand, I am. I can. You know, one of the things that we were working on was a kind of initial episode about the Beatles, because, you know, start with the big ones. And one of the things that I can say that I remember, just to show how old I actually am, was that the Beatles were on the Ed Sullivan Show, and I think in February 1964. I was in junior high school. And I can remember coming, I've never heard of the Beatles before, but I can still clearly remember, to the extent that memory works at all, there was a group of girls standing in the hallway, all excitedly talking to each other about whether or not they had seen them. Did you see them? Did you see their hair? Did you listen to the music? And I had no idea what they were talking about, and I eventually figured out that they were talking about the Beatles.
Right.
And that, I have to say, is what interested me as a 12 or 13-year-old boy about the Beatles. Not their music, but the fact that apparently girls became excited about them. So what was it that these guys were doing that I should copy? And thus, I, like so many others, began growing our hair out.
Yes, that is not exactly breaking news. The young men often, find the interest or try to understand the interests of the young women around them.
Yes.
Anyway, I'm sure that's going to be a fascinating series, and I look forward to that.
I hope so.
And yeah, maybe we'll have.
Let me mention one more thing in terms of shameless self-promotion. One of the things that a friend that I by the name of Stephen Austin and I have decided to do, like apparently everyone else in the world, is to start our own podcast.
Hey.
So for anyone who is interested, it's does not have high production values. There are sometimes issues with the audio, and it doesn't have lots of fancy pictures. It's just us talking. Well, mostly it's me talking and him asking questions. It's called Strange as It Seems, and you can find episodes on Spotify, and now there are some that are showing up on YouTube.
Wow.
So anybody who's interested.
Well, the easiest thing to do is to get yourself a microphone, and it'll improve the audio by tenfold. So and you can get them really cheap. Actually, my friend ordered me this one. I paid him back. It was $24, including the shipping and handling. So there you go. In any event, so that's great. So way back when, I sort of gave you a list of things I was interested in, and we narrowed those down to a few, and then expanded again. And you just said, yeah, we'll see how far we can get. So I'm going to let you start, because I don't know how deep or wide these various topics go with. But just so the audience knows, because I'm going to give you complete freedom in picking the order and the chronology of the subjects. But we talked to the Essenes, the Cathars, the Templars, and the Assassins, which, I always sort of group together, although there's like 1,300 years in there, some or maybe more. At least that's my primitive understanding. And then I think we said the Rosicrucians. I don't know if we said the Masons or the Hermetics, but they're all sort of in the same trajectory. And then some names, Helena Blavatsky, Rudolf Steiner, and I think I said Aleister Crowley. And again, there's about 100, 150 years between them, but they're sort of, as I understand, sort of a straight line between them. So again, I guess we'll get as far as we can get, and we'll go as deep as you think we need to go.
Okay. Well, there a lot of Crowley is a world unto himself in many ways. So we'll see whether we get as far as Aleister Crowley. His name has already come up. This is the thing I've noticed, is whatever you're talking about, in some way, his name will come up. But let's go back. Let's go back to the ancient world, and let's go back to the Roman Empire. Why not? That's considered to be the start for so many things. The Hellenistic world. And and maybe draw a connection between that and the medieval world is an interesting way that, I'm an historian, for anybody who's asking, I actually do have a actual PhD in history, which apparently is a license to do something. I'm not entirely sure. Or it's a piece of paper that you spend a lot of time getting. Somebody once described degrees, whether they're BAs or MAs or PhDs, as authority claims.
Mm-hmm.
That is, by possessing this piece of paper, you can claim some kind of authority in terms of whatever it says. And I think that's probably true, but the thing about it is history as a discipline, I think, is important because it's a compendium of everything that human beings have done. And one of the reasons why, for instance, I'd prefer to study history than, say, chemistry or physics or engineering. One is that those all involve math.
Me too.
Generally, history is not. Okay, that's a strong point. But also in history, you study everything. And it has so many different facets to it. You can look at social history, economic history, but it's just basically all the stuff that human beings have ever done and said. And out of that, we constantly go through it. We're going through this midden heat trying to pull out various artifacts or things that will hopefully help us explain how we got to the state that we are now. So one of the things, and let me start out by saying that I'm not a classical historian, so my main sort of academic training is in modern European, Eastern Europe, and Russian history in particular, and things like military history, espionage, and occultism in the modern sense. But it's all linked together. So my general impression as an historian about the period of ancient history is that what impresses me most is how little we actually know.
Scary.
You would assume that we just know everything that there is to know about the Greeks and Romans because we never shut up about them. And this is also considered to be some sort of watershed. One of the things to look at, I think even to this day, certainly up until fairly recently, if you wanted an impressive civic building, what did you do?
Put columns on it.
Okay, you made it look like a Roman building because, apparently the Romans were just completely cool, along with being degenerate. We can never quite figure out which of those we want to have, but their buildings were cool and they were symbols of authority, and therefore we still tend to mimic these kind of ancient civilizations. And yet we don't know a lot of them. Most of the literature, the Romans has had some variety of popular literature, almost none of which survives. You just got little, smatterings here and there. And then when you begin to look at other peoples, the subject peoples in the empires, the Jews, the Gauls, whoever these people were, you only tend to see them through Roman eyes in many respects. And so you don't have a lot of information. There aren't many sources. You're often dealing with 2 or 3, maybe one guy who's talking about something. And it's not to say that the information there is necessarily wrong. It's just that you don't have anything to compare it with. And one of the reasons why I think that is important is that one of the things that you find when you're doing research, whether it's things ancient or things modern, is that the more sources about something you have to compare, the better the picture is going to be. You're going to have more, you've got more data points to go through. Because seldom do sources agree. Even when you're talking about something that's, again, fairly recent, that there are numerous witnesses to, and you're going to find that you never get quite the same story from any person who was there. And that is, it's one of the things that can make it very frustrating. In a way, having only one source simplifies things because you don't have to compare it with anything else. But you always have to remember that it's just that one source. If there was someone else writing about the same thing or the same person, they would probably have some kind of issue with that. And when it comes to, if we're looking at the ancient world, particularly if we're looking at the relationship between the Roman Empire and their Jewish subjects, the Roman rule of Judea, the guy who reigns supreme over everything is Flavius Josephus. Now, Josephus is, it depends on how you want to see him. He is born a Jew. He fights in the rebellion. He goes over to the Romans. In some ways, he is a turncoat, and yet he never leaves. He becomes a Roman, but his whole concept apparently is that one could be both a Jew and a Roman. This was, he really thought that, you should just get in with the empire and become part of this and become Roman citizens. And in terms of he's the main source of information about this. Anything that he mentions, one of the things that people find is that Josephus makes mentions to Jesus of Galilee. This is somehow taken as one of the primary sources of evidence that Jesus actually existed, which otherwise you don't have a lot of information to go on. There's the whole reason that could be debated is because there's just not much in the way of sources. But since Josephus basically just mentions him in a couple of cases, makes references to it, that's taken as an important proof simply of the existence, even though it doesn't really tell you very much. And so we put a great deal of importance upon this sort of single source. And you find that Josephus is also an important source. You have others, Pliny mentions them. They crop up. They were noticed by people in this period of one of what were considered to be the three main sects of Roman era Judaism. And you've got the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and then you've got the Essenes, who appear to have been the smallest of the group. One doesn't get the references that there weren't any more than a few to several thousand of them. But they're interesting in a lot of ways. One of the reasons they're interesting is that, back in the 40s, they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, the parchments, which revealed, and where, again, there are things mentioned. Here's another data point that you can find. But the Essenes are interesting because, well, in their day, they seem to have been regarded as something that we would now call a cult, as opposed to a sect. It doesn't seem that the differences that the Sadducees, the main sects, and the Pharisees had with each other, they both would have seemed to have viewed the Essenes as something outside the pale. And the interesting thing about them, to me, is the little bit you get, is that they lived communally.
Right.
And they didn't believe in private property. So they lived in a commune, in a kind of communal state. They were celibate. This was one of the things you had to do. So as a group, they did not reproduce, and therefore the only way in which the sect could perpetuate itself was by recruitment. You had to bring new people in. They were arguably, didn't eat meat. Vegetarianism was an important part of it. They viewed themselves as the keeper of secrets. There was some sort of mystical doctrine, which they were, this is always think that there's something, they were entrusted with that. Relatively small, secretive, don't seem to have had any kind of, it's not clear what sort of hierarchy they had in terms of leadership. They did not believe in the priesthood. They seem not to have had, there certainly were people who were in charge of some things, but a kind of dispersed leadership. But those are all things that sort of set them apart from other groups. And now keep in mind, we're talking about what we today refer to as the Middle East, which then and now was an extremely diverse, complicated area. There's never been a time in history that I can tell in which that was not the case. You've got all kinds of currents going back and forth. And I think that's an important thing to understand about that particular region, is that it's a crossroads. It's a crossroads between Europe, between Asia, between Africa, elements moving out of Central Asia, from the Indian subcontinent, even from China beyond that, from Egypt. And then, of course, the Romans connect all of this with areas stretching as far afield as Scotland and the British Isles. All of these currents tend to pass through that region, which means a lot of things come in. And so I'll just sort of throw this idea, when I go through that sort of list of the characteristics of the Essenes, question might be, does that remind you of anything else?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Hippies.
And who to you does it remind you of?
Hippies, but not celibate.
Okay, hippies, not celibate hippies. There's also one of the things that it reminds me of is Buddhism.
Or the Hare Krishna sect of the Krishners, or at least as they were portrayed to me as a youth in the late 70s, early 80s. Yeah, but my source for the Essenes, or Essenes as they're properly pronounced, but when it is you'll find out quickly, is because I read it, was Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code. So I was led to believe that Jesus' let's just say stepfather, to keep things simple, was an Essene, at least from Dan Brown. Now, I know, listen, even when reading it, I didn't assume this to be historical fact, but I figured that there was enough there that at least it was, possibly there was some historicity to it. But yeah, even then they seemed sort of like hippies, and the Cathars sort of seemed a little hippie-ish as well. Again, but they do. I mean, I don't want to say the Manson family because, they're known for the murders, but before the murders, there was, they were living together communally. I mean, but without the celibacy. But the bee and the boo, the people who were waiting for the flying saucer to come back, and they all killed themselves with the Nike shoes, and they were all androgynous. I mean, they were sort of celibate and, hippy-dippy-ish, and basically a people Ponzi scheme where they didn't reproduce, they recruited, but I think they only want to have 30. It doesn't matter. The point is, yes, there's lots of characteristics you described that reminds me of things that exist today and likely existed before. But you were on Buddhism, so let's go there.
Well, Buddhism, another group I throw in are the Shakers.
Oh yeah,
this British, 18th century. And the interesting thing is that when you look in different places in different times, you find these ideas sort of reoccurring. So the Shakers and the Essenes aren't identical. There are differences, but there are similarities between them. There are similarities with, let's say, the 12th and 13th century Cathars in Europe. There are similarities with Buddhism, or some of and there are many sects within Buddhism as well. And the question about that, when you find these kind of similarities, when you find the same sort of behavior or ideas cropping up in different places, often centuries apart, with seemingly no connecting threads between them, and it just pops up here, then it pops up somewhere else, are there connecting threads? Is there some sort of continuity among these groups? And it's similar to the way that do ideas, which let's think of in a way as a kind of virus, a kind of mind virus.
Yeah.
That's a very pleasant way of thinking about it. But there's this kind of, ideas are contagious. They do often function as a kind of virus. Is it that this virus only can thrive under certain circumstances, that for long periods of time it goes dormant, and then when the time is right, as H.P. Lovecraft would put it, when the stars are right, it will reappear. But that also suggests that in the interim, while it's dormant, there's still something just keeping it alive. And how exactly does that work? Or is it spontaneous regeneration? That it appears, it disappears. And take the Cathars, for instance. The Cathars, as a sect, are by the 14th century are essentially exterminated.
Right.
And this is, there is a genocidal extermination of this group. And they hang on for a while. I mean, I think the last reference to a Cathar bishop is somewhere around 1400. But eventually you don't hear about them anymore. So, maybe they wised up and changed their name and disguised themselves as something else in order to escape that. Maybe the sect simply was no longer had the kind of critical mass of people to continue. But then you go ahead a few centuries and you've got some Russian peasant, Daniel Filipov, who's, working out of the field one day, and an angel appears to him and begins dictating orders, which end up with him creating a sect which in many ways mimics the Cathars.
Right.
Not exactly, but quite similar. So is it this kind of spontaneous regeneration, or is it this issue of flourishing and dormancy with some kind of continuum between the two? We don't know.
Right.
And I'm not going to push either. I'm just saying it's got to be one or the other, but we're not really sure which. So when you go back to something like the Essenes, I think you're right in what you suggested, is that they're probably not the ones who originated this. They're continuing or modifying ideas and traditions that had existed before them. There's a kind of withdrawal from the world. It's one of the things you find within these. And one of the things that's often a key component of that is that you don't reproduce. Okay? You deny your programming. Think of it this way, because if there's anything which all living creatures are programmed to do. In fact, the only real reason that anybody can give you as to why living things exist and why they perpetuate is to create more of themselves.
Right.
Okay, I know that that's not what people want to hear, but reproduction is the only obvious natural purpose we or grasshoppers or viruses or anything have. That's it. So that's the point of view. So to deny that aspect, to essentially refuse or to suppress all of the urges that you have been programmed, to deny the natural programming you have, is a fairly powerful and defiant act. It's a way, literally, of sort of defying the matrix, if you want to think of it that way. If you think of nature as this kind of matrix.
Well, I mean, a lot of priests and nuns do the same. So I imagine this was that kind of chastity wasn't, devotion to a god or gods wasn't originated with Christianity either. So, I mean, to extend it to everyone is just an extension of the communal idea to the, as you're saying, in the most extreme sense, that you're sacrificing and have the discipline to control your one soul, pre-programmed, double helix biological imperative, which is to reproduce. I mean, in addition to eat, drink, and keep warm. But one could argue those things are just to allow you to live long enough to reproduce.
Stay alive to reproduce. Okay?
Right.
That's it.
Yeah.
All right. That's it. You need to eat, drink, and breathe in order to stay alive, to screw and make babies. That's it.
We call it but-for causation in my business.
Yes. So the ideas had been around. So it's this interesting kind of defiant, rebellious trend. But within this is the idea that this is not a legitimate world. It's a rejection of this whole, that the world is fundamentally, well, there's something wrong with it. The simplest way to put it, the physical world is an evil realm. It's a trap. And that the only way that you can escape this is to die and then to transcend that into some sort of greater or purer world which is beyond, to escape this trap, and then also to not bring more people into it.
Right.
This is and I mean, that's one of the things which is very central to certain aspects of Gnosticism. I suppose that's the other thing that I tend to see in the Essenes, is that there's Gnosticism is one of those terms I think that gets used too widely to describe a lot of things that are only vaguely similar to each other. But one of the concepts you have there, again, is that there's a kind of dualism. The other term that I've seen connected to the Essenes is that they're dualistic. They have a dualistic theology, which basically means that there's a good God and a bad God, right, or the single God with two different aspects. And the bad God is, or the imperfect God, maybe that's the better way to put it, is the one which is essentially the architect and the ruler of the physical world. The term then used later for that in later Gnostic writing is the demiurge, the builder.
I love the demiurge. And I love his little archons, which also was Lovecraft borrowed the term. I mean, yeah.
So, the demiurge isn't necessarily bad. He's just, possibly insane. That could be part of it.
Well, he's bad when they decided that the Jewish God was the demiurge. I mean, it's sort of a little anti-Semitic, though. I mean, though one could take issue with the Jewish God as well. I mean, in some...
He tends to be vain. There's certain aspects to it there, and vengeful.
Yeah.
So, not someone you want to piss off.
Definitely not.
Part of it. But they all kind of tend to be that way. They're all very touchy.
Yeah.
I mean, the Greek and Roman gods, the main thing to do is you're trying not to offend them.
Pretty much.
This is what so it's the demiurge is he's just fallible. He's an imperfect being who thinks he's perfect and has created an imperfect world. And thus you get all kinds of things. That apparently explains mosquitoes and ticks and everything else that you have. All of these things that would be a better world if they didn't exist, you would think. All of his malicious creations and the rest of it. But then all of the delicious things with it as well. The physical world has all of these things that we enjoy, other than sex. That's one part of it. This whole kind of huge chemical compulsion that forces you to do something that otherwise would be disgusting. So, I mean, look what you do. You're possessed. Because it's warm and has tasty food, and there are all of these things that you would want to be part of. But the other thing about it is it's going to kill you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It's ultimately this kind of road to nowhere, other than this constant cycle of repetition and recreating oneself in some way to what particular end, other than these creatures just continue to change and reproduce.
I had fried chicken with apple pie a la mode last night.
Yeah. I know. So there's really good stuff that, what would you trade your soul for at a certain point in time? Assuming you've got one. There you go. There's the whole little argument on that as well. But, so there is, one of the things, I brought up Buddhism because one of the things which has intrigued me is that the Cathars, which in a different place, at a different time, southern France, northern Italy, also off into the Balkans. They seem to spread across southern Europe. And we're talking about something that, around 1200 to 1300 is sort of their heyday, even though they sort of gradually appear and gradually fade away. Then they have this whole dualistic point of view. Celibacy for them was not required of everyone. It wasn't required, let's say, for lay people, although you were encouraged as much as you could. Refrain from procreation and sex as much as you possibly can. But it was a requirement for a kind of priestly class, the perfecti, the perfects. And therefore the goal of ordinary people in the Cathar Church was to support, to feed, clothe, and shelter the perfects, the people who had accepted this rule of celibacy and a kind of itinerant lifestyle, and who literally seem to have traveled around from place to place very much like wandering Buddhist monks, who again are expected to be fed and clothed and sheltered by the lay population. And that has led someone, I honestly can't remember who's argued that the Cathars were a kind of Western Buddhism. Changed, certainly modified from what it was, but that Buddhism had made its way into the Middle East, and from the Middle East into the Balkans, and from the Balkans spreading throughout southern Europe. It had found fertile ground in these areas. And that's really, when you're looking at the Cathar sect, or as they called themselves, since they never used that name, the good people, or as they put it in some cases, the good Christians, as they called themselves, who saw themselves as something completely separate from the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church of its time. that this was it. It was simply Buddhism in a kind of new dress with slightly different customs. Which then, looking at the similarities centuries before with the Essenes, Buddhism has been around for a while, as to whether or not that might have been an influence there. And it does show up. There's a bit after the Essenes. You've got this fellow who shows up around 200, Mani, who gives rise to this thing called Manichaeanism. And Manichaeanism, this is also what actually most people in the Catholic Church called the Cathars, the Manichees. They because they looked at them and they saw, even though Manichaeanism supposedly as an organized religion had been gone for centuries, in sort of comparing their behavior, the Inquisition decided these people are Manichaeans. That's what they saw, that connection. And I think we should pay attention to the fact that they saw the connection between them. But Mani's one of these guys, shows up in what's now probably somewhere between Iraq and Syria, gathered a fair number of followers around himself, but would make references both to Jewish practices and mysticism, to Zoroastrian ideas, but would also reference both Jesus and Buddha. Okay, he's the only guy who talked about both of them, that they were both sort of important prophetic religious figures, and this was all combined. But he also talked about the two gods, the true world, the true God, which is transcendent, which is not in this world, but which rules the greater universe, and the kind of mundane or earthly prison which the demiurge has created. And that's what it was that later Catholic inquisitors thought were the key elements that the Cathars were talking about, and therefore they were Manichees, or they were Manichaeans.
The first matrix.
Yeah, so it's a so I think that I don't think it is the explanation, but I think it is an idea worth considering as to how far these ideas come. And I think part of that is because from the Western standpoint, we tend to think of Buddhism, other than the Westerners who embrace it for that reason, as being particularly Asian, as being particularly Eastern. It's a thing that you find in China, or that you find in Southeast Asia, or is all over Thailand if you go on vacation. But the thing often forgotten is that where Buddhism arises is not in China, it's in India.
Right.
And India is sort of right next to Persia, okay? And Persia is then the large empire that waxes and wanes, and at various times rules over much of the Middle East. There was a whole issue some years back, the first time the Taliban took control of Afghanistan, and they started blowing up these large statues of Buddha. And the interesting thing about it was that it showed that centuries before, Buddhism, long before Islam appeared, was the prevailing faith in that area of the world. And even within, again, if we go back to the period of around 1300 or so, the Mongol conquest of Persia and much of the Middle East. So the Mongols come in, burn a lot of stuff, quite destructive, but nonetheless conquer Persia in the 1200s, eventually set up the Ilkhanate, another Mongol dynasty that will rule Persia. And the initial Mongol rulers of Persia are Buddhists. So one of the things that happens to the Mongols is that they adopt Buddhism. They all start out worshiping Wan Tengri, the endless blue sky, the gray wolf and the fowl. They have their own particular pagan pantheon. But by the time they conquer Persia, they become Buddhists. Persia by this time was earlier Zoroastrian, but which has now been Islamicized by the Arab conquest. So you've got Buddhist Mongols ruling over an Islamicized Persian population. And their idea initially was to simply impose Buddhism as the state religion over their version of the Persian Empire. Eventually that didn't happen, and the Ilkhans became Muslims themselves. But that's how close Buddhism became. And that's why it's not something which is so far distant and completely alien from anything European. So if you think of it that way, the currents have been coming, the influence, the percolation of Buddhist ideas into the Western environment had been going on for centuries. So that it found its way into the manifestations of things like the Essenes, the Cathars centuries before is, I don't find far-fetched. I don't think that necessarily explains everything. But it's one.
I'm giggling a little bit on the inside because that doesn't sound very Buddhist to impose your religion. The other is that the Mongols tried to start it and fell, and since then I think Richard Gere has done more to expand Buddhism than anyone else. Maybe Richard Gere, large carrot the Mongols in terms of spreading Buddhism.
Yeah. Well, the Mongols became Buddhists, but they were still Mongols.
Right.
So that was the way that you did things, is that you made the world peaceful by conquering all the peoples around you and imposing your control over them. But if everybody got in line, you cut their heads off. Let's create a mountain of skulls. But nevertheless, it's also worship Lord.
Buddhism by sword seems like a different. I'm sorry. Buddhism by conscription, by sword, seems like a different religion. Like it would have to take on a different name. I don't know. Anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
It would, but it's part of this. It's an adaptation and mutation. The other thing is that things are always changing. So I mean, you can take that again down to the sort of natural order of things. One of the things that happens in this process of constant reproduction is that over a period of time, things become different.
Well, it's like they took the life is suffering and forgot the rest.
So it's a interesting idea, but it's so you can look for those kinds of connections. But the thing about them is that they're only, they're never perfectly similar. You never get an exact recreation of something. So you can always have this question as to whether or not, is this the same thing which has appeared well, for lack of a better term, it's a kind of evolution idea. You take an organism and you place it in a different environment, and it will, according to the Darwinian idea, it will either perish or it will adapt to those circumstances. And as it adapts, it will preserve some of the characteristics that it had, but it will also change into something else. Whales are, as far as we can tell, descended from terrestrial four-legged animals, who just liked swimming a lot, and eventually began swimming and found out that was an easier, squid was really quite tasty, whatever it was lured them to do it, and, but they still have the sort of remnants, they still have the mammary glands, they still have to come to the surface to breathe. I mean, they still have those characteristics that they can't change. And so the similarities are only there if you begin to look closely.
Bones, bones, calcium bones.
It kind of looks like a fish, and it lives with fish, but it's not a fish. It's a mammal in that way.
So this is sort of like philosophical or theological, which maybe is the same thing. Divergence isn't that the theory of evolution? How different strategies appear in different places independently and sort of recycle themselves. So the cheetah, the jaguar, the leopard, the ocelot, spotted animals. That sort of is that called divergence?
I'm not sure.
I'm not either.
Biologist. Well, the other thing you can find is the. You can find that at different periods of time, similar sort of looking animals begin to appear. At one point in the evolution of reptiles, if my knowledge of this, you get this whole period in which they all became sort of mammal-like. I mean, they really do. And you can find the same sort of animals filling the same sort of niches. Something is going to come along, and it's going to be the apex predator, and then you're going to have smaller predators under them. You're going to have, one of the ways is that if you're a herbivore, you can survive simply by becoming massive in size, making it more difficult to hunt and kill. In other cases, the strategy is to become small and inconspicuous. Being medium-sized and conspicuous is not a good evolutionary strategy.
Right.
So you want to go for one or the other. But, if a particular species, if the prevailing apex predator disappears, another species will fill that niche. It will begin to change in order to take that place. So similar things constantly begin to appear. So there's an interesting way. If you look at the natural world, you'll notice that similar things begin to show up in different places. Maybe millions of years apart, you still get creatures who are doing the same sort of thing. Some might be mammals, some might be reptiles. So should we be terribly surprised later on that ideas, which in their own way are kind of living things, perpetuated in human communities, begin to reappear and take slightly different forms, always kind of adapting themselves to the circumstances?
Yeah, well, fits in with it. Time is a flat line if you look at it from a far enough distance.
Or is it a flat circle?
That could be too.
We go with the true detective idea. That was the one of the things that haunted me from that. Time is a flat circle. Everything we've done and ever will do, we'll just end up doing again.
Well, it fits in with this conversation. Either way.
Yes. Well, it's whatever we want to imagine it is, because really, when you talk about things like that, you're just spitballing.
Mm-hmm.
That's my historian's very jaundiced view of philosophy, which is that all these guys are just spitballing. They don't know anything. Okay? They're just taking their own experiences and they're extrapolating those into some kind of cosmic truths. And so, it's kind of interesting, but should I really take them seriously?
Well, I happen to agree, especially when, and we'll get to the figures. Maybe we'll get to them at the end of the show. I'm starting to think that we won't get to some of the individual figures, but some of them obviously took bits and pieces of other philosophies, strung them together as their sort of their version of what it was, and got people who did follow them and to this day follow them. Though you also have the people who sort of smosh their visions together. An extreme example would be the Zecharia Sitchin version of the Anunnaki, which, he took the 7 tablets and sort of made up a lot of his own sort of science fiction thing. But there's a lot of people who take that as absolute fact, that is history. And you can't convince them otherwise, nor should you try. But, you take bits and pieces and you sort of start your own philosophy. And maybe in 100 years, people will look back and say Sitchinians. I have no idea. But yeah, so I think we were sort of at the Cathars, which I keep wanting to say Cathars. And again, my primary first source was Dan Brown. And then, of course, all the copycats or the ones he copycatted from that I visited afterwards, which are mostly historical fiction to pure fiction. But something to do with, it all has to do with Solomon's treasure or some type of treasure, maybe the line of Jesus, maybe the Holy Grail, maybe, gold. Philip borrowed too much money from them for his wars and he pretended it was a religious conquest, really was a money grab or a cancellation of debts to fuel the Crusades. But somehow out of the Cathars sprung the Templars. That's the myth history.
Well, then you hit upon here. Dan Brown is a good example of it. What did Dan Brown? Dan Brown essentially popularized another book.
Yeah.
It's what is it?
Holy Blood, Holy Grail.
The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail.
Right.
So they're the ones who, and I remember I had read that book when it came out, and I thought it was kind of interesting. And, they were true believers. They were completely taken in by this. And they got their whole idea about the Priory of Zion, which is this secret society that was created to protect the whole secret of the essential idea is that, Jesus didn't die on the cross. He married Mary. And they all went off to France and had a bunch of kids, all right? And then somehow some of those kids became heirs to the French throne, the Merovingian dynasty. It's an interesting story, but it's a completely different story than the standard one the church was telling. And there you've got the whole kind of dramatic tension between the secret that has to be guarded. Well, where the Bagent and Lincoln and Lee got this from was from the existence of an organization that was founded, that actually was created as a secret society in France in the 1950s, I think in 1956, by a fellow by the name of Pierre Plantard. And so you can, and we know this because there was a law in France in the 1950s, in the Fourth Republic, that if you formed an oath-bound secret society, you had to register it. It can't be that secret. You have to register it with the government. You have to keep a list of members. And the thing about Plantard is that the guy's a con man. Okay, there's nothing else in his career that suggests anything else. Okay, he has no great religious training. During World War II, he was he was a fascist, basically. He was an adherent of the Vichy regime. And then later goes, and sort of creates this thing. There was even the sort of creation of the dossier secret, which was supposedly the list of all the Grand Master of this, which is a forgery, which then, someone with him actually tried to plant into the Bibliothèque Nationale to create a backstory for this thing. But it's a fraud. I mean, now it doesn't mean that something called the Prieur de Zion hadn't actually existed. He may well have been referencing something that had existed previously, whether or not it's what he claimed to be, but his iteration of it in the 50s is a scam. There's nothing more fancy about that, but they fell for it. And why did they fall for it? Because it was a good story. This is the thing that you would find, is that the good story will always trump the truth.
Right.
Or a less interesting story. Because that's what we like. And that's really what we want history to be. We want it to be a succession of good stories. It's got to have dramatic, sympathetic characters. And it also has to have an arc. See? There has to be some kind of conclusion to it. The story has to lead to a conclusion. When it really doesn't. What actual history leads you to is what we were just talking about in terms of the Cathars and the Essenes. The Essenes sort of lived down in the fringes of Judea, and they did some kind of weird stuff. Okay, which is kind of similar to other weird stuff that sects have done, but we really don't know much more about them than that. I mean, that's the story as best as you can put it together. But see, it's not a very convincing story.
Right.
Whereas now we got the whole bloodline of Mary and Jesus, and we've got this whole... So the Holy Blood, Holy Grail authors adopt this whole thing, and then they can connect it to that's what the Cathars are doing. Yeah. See, the Cathars were this whole sect that were trying to guard this, and this is why they oppose the church. This whole thing, it becomes this great dramatic story stretching over centuries. Well, they published their book as a work of history. They were arguing that this was real and it had actually happened. Now, maybe Dan Brown believed it was really true, maybe he didn't, but this, I would argue, is what he saw. Was a damn good story. So he took it, repackaged it as historical fiction, and took off because people really liked that story. And this is why later, when Beijing Li sued him for ripping them off, which, arguably, maybe he did, they lost because he was never arguing that what he was just saying, I'm running a work of fiction which was inspired by your nonfiction. So I'm just taking this thing that you said was history and I'm turning it into a more elaborated story. So I'm just sort of elaborating on that.
Right, it's called transformative. It's not copyright infringement.
The argument was you can't plagiarize history. So if you argue it's real, then that's it. So all I'm doing is I'm taking the story. But yeah, Dan Brown is the best example that the good story will win out. And that will tend to overpower everything else. And then what happens is that the good story then becomes canon. It somehow is accepted as being real. And everything has to compete against that. And that's been going on for thousands of years.
Right.
And this is why the question becomes, and so many of the things that we take as being history, as being things that really happened, what you're getting in many cases is the good story that survived and perpetuated because it was such a good story.
Indeed, it was. And listen,
well, let me be quite heretical about this,
sure.
and perhaps even blasphemous. But I'm just trying to throw this out there. I mean, which is the better story? That Jesus was the Son of God, died on the cross, died for everyone's sins, ascended into heaven, and will someday return. That's one version of it. Or that, he was simply a kind of prophet, divinely inspired, married his girlfriend, went off and sired a line of French kings. Well, now, both of those are kind of interesting stories, but you can't have both of them at the same time.
Oh, yeah.
And yet, that's really all they are.
Right. I mean, I would say that the first one is probably the more epical story, but if you're looking at it as a 2,000-year-old story, the new version becomes the more interesting one because it's new.
And it's more human in a certain way. Sort of it brings things down to a human scale. That's one of the arguments, for instance, has been used as to why the Virgin Mary became such a popular figure. Really becomes the goddess of Roman Christianity. That's what she is, let's face it. And why? Well, one argument is that you always need a goddess. You have to have that feminine in there in some way. But the other is that she's human and accessible. And in fact, the church tells you that she's accessible because you access the Son through her. She's your portal to God. And she is still, even though she is a saint, she is, like all saints, was originally human. They still have this human characteristic to them. And, she's a mother who loses her child. And that, again, was something that so many people could identify with. She's a very human, sympathetic figure. And that, I think it's a good story, but it's also a good explanation of why she becomes the sort of centerpiece of this whole religion.
Oh, yeah. And a lot of people pointed that the cult of Mary is very similar to the cult of Isis. And
yes.
Isis, too, sort of lost her son, though. He came back.
See, it's the same thing in different clothing. I mean, the same symbolism is involved in it. Every time you look at a picture of Mary standing on a crescent, that's Isis standing on her solar boat. They just recycle the images and then change the explanation of what those images are. So it's just another case of the same things reappearing in different forms. That's history for you.
Absolutely. So then is there any relationship between the Cathars and the Templars, or is that whole cloth fiction? Or maybe some, they came from southern France, some did, some didn't?
Well, the Templars we got a few good data points with them. Again, you go back to what you can essentially establish as facts. So they start out as a kind of warrior monastic order, 9 guys who get together after the first crusade and decide that, pilgrims coming here needs help. And we'll it's a kind of aid society, which over time changes into something else. It eventually becomes a real estate banking empire. But it eventually just starts out as this group of people who are going to take oaths of chastity and poverty, and they're going to now serve Christendom and the church by aiding pilgrims. And they camp out on the Temple Mount. They do a lot of excavating there. Now, one idea is that they're excavating to look for the Ark of the Covenant and all kinds of cool stuff that's been buried there over the centuries. The other is they're just excavating because the soil or the sandstone was, it was easy to excavate, but it was fairly stable, and they were using that for storerooms and stables.
Right. Or both.
Now, again, which is the better story? Is they just doing this with storerooms and stables, or Ark of the Covenant? Okay. Well, that one is going to pick up more. So they get a special charter from the Pope. They're answerable only to him. Over the next 200 years, the order grows, becomes very successful, holding hundreds of properties in Europe, acquiring a substantial amount of money, although no one knows exactly how much. the Crusades end, their value to the church and European society declines. The order clearly was declining by 1300. And then you've got this guy who's, very clearly a gangster, who is, Philip the Fair of France, who is ruthless and desperate for money. And really, if you look at it, he simply does to the Templars in 1307 what he did to the Jews in France in 1306, which is essentially, he had borrowed lots of money from them. Then he just decides that, okay, I'm going to expel you. Okay, you'll have to get out. And to make things very clear, I'm going to take a bunch of you and burn you on an island in the Seine. Okay, the Ile de Juice, which is just right next door to where Jacques de Molay is toasted some years later. So he starts out by ripping off the Jews in France, and then he looks around for the next big source of money, which supposedly are the Templars, and and he's also taken the Pope captive. This is the other thing, is that this is now the whole Avignon captivity of the papacy. So the Pope is essentially his puppet at this point. So he gets them to disestablish the order, goes after them, never gets his hands on their money, maybe because there wasn't any money. Mm-hmm. Now, here again, you got a couple of stories. One, turns out they didn't actually have any money. The other story is that, no, they put it on a fleet and they sent it to Nova Scotia and buried it on Oak Island. Where people are still looking for it, even though it's almost certainly not there. The better story, no treasure or a treasure hidden in Canada. Which would you rather have?
Well, I will tell you that Gretchen Cornwell was on the show, and at the time, that was her first appearance before she sort of had a falling out with the Oak Island people. And after that, she reconcile with them, and the Oak Island series has been, so it's sort of my fault that this is still going on, because if it wasn't for me, she might have still been in her self-imposed isolation, or at least I'm taking credit for it, though, as she would not acknowledge it. In fact, she has told me that that's not what the reason is. So in fairness, I can speak for him saying, no, it wasn't all you, Jeff, but I'm still going to take credit for it anyway.
But you played your part in it.
I played my part in her.
And I'm not going to sit here and insist that there's just no way that could ever have happened. I think it's pretty close to that, but it's a good story.
Templars by now, they've now made their way to South America. I'm sure before I'm dead, they'll be in Australia.
Yeah, the Templars are everywhere. They
like Elvis.
Continually metastasize and begin to spread out. So, if you look at if I look at the story of the Templars, it seems that they were simply an order in decline that were victimized by a ruthless French king, with the connivance of a captive pope, and nobody quite got what they wanted out of it. Did they go on to mutate to become Freemasons? Well, later on, a lot of Freemasons think they did. That becomes this widespread belief by the 18th century Freemasonry, even though there's no actual document to show that. It's just this idea that many Freemasons had. And there's this whole sort of process that the Templars basically disappear as an organized group in history in 1314. Okay, that's when Jacques de Molay and the other remaining leader, and the reason why he is executed is because he had recanted, he had confessed to his sins and had been forgiven by the Pope for them. And then he had abjured, he had rejected that, and that's why he was then, the king had him burned. And so the order is disestablished, except it's only disestablished in certain places. It's never disestablished in Portugal, where it just changes its name to the Order of Christ and just continues right on, holds the same property. Same thing in Aragon, same thing in parts of Germany and Italy. So the whole idea that the Templars disappear, they're all rounded up and killed, that never happens. Virtually no one is killed. Most of the order and its properties remain intact under sort of successor corporations.
Mm-hmm.
That might be one way of thinking of it. You have this large corporation, and various subsidiaries continue. They change their name, but they continue their operation with the same people.
Is that the Teutonic Knights in Germany, or is it a different name entirely?
That's a different order. That's a different order. Even, some of them might have been Templars at some point, but they're the ones that go off and conquer the Baltic.
Right, because I'm trying to figure, because the Templars sort of had the, a red version, but of sort of the Iron Cross. The Templar, of course, is most notably associated as the Iron Cross these days of the Nazis. And the Nazis, of course, were trying to do the same thing.
The Templars are supposed to be red on a white field.
Right.
So when you get the Knights Hospitallers, which then become the Knights of Malta, just to keep things even more complicated. So see, they survive. They just go on, and they're still around. So is it possible that at some point, since parts of this organization survived, that they gradually transmuted into these fake Masonic organizations? And by fake, this is what I mean. There are real Masons. There are people who stack rocks together and build things, cathedrals, whatever they might be. And the Templar Order actually had a whole group within the Templar Order. Most of the people within the Templar Order are lay people. So, for instance, at its peak, the Templar Order probably employed around 20,000 people. But out of that 20,000, only about 10% were knights.
Mm-hmm.
Were knights who had taken the full vows of chastity and poverty. And then there were people who were their retainers, their sort of, men-at-arms who didn't take full vows. They were just sort of soldiers. And then there were people, you could also just come and be a Templar for a while. If you're rich and you wanted to pay some money and go to Templar camp, well, you could go in and you could just take vows for a certain period of time, fight with them, maybe get some land and then leave. Those were the confrères, the sort of brother knights who would come. So different kinds of knights, and then you had all the people who kept the thing going, the accountants, and then you had the Mason brothers, and these were, these were the guys that did the building for them. The knights didn't go out and do this stuff.
Right.
They didn't stack rocks together. They actually had people who knew how to do that working for them. So is it possible in some way that the Mason brothers, the sort of Masonic element within the Templars sort of carried on? Yeah, it's possible. But what you get later on in Masonry, keep in mind, is it's rich guys pretending to be Masons. They're not. In some cases, you could surprisingly find that there's someone who's an actual Mason who is a Freemason.
Right.
But that's not usual.
Correct.
Yeah, but you get to even by the 18th century, who are they? They are noblemen, landowners, generally fairly educated people. By the 18th century, they are businessmen and professionals. Doctors, lawyers, businessmen. They're fairly well-to-do.
Mm-hmm.
Joining the Masonic Lodge was an admission to the bourgeoisie. It was an admission to the upper classes.
Well, think about the heroes in any literature that takes place in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, even half of the 19th century, and they're always the nobility. They're never worried about money, except in Dickens, because they were. And
it's expensive. All of this regalia is that you have to buy all this stuff, and there's a basic reason for that, because if you make the cost of membership high enough, you keep out the riffraff. So they didn't want a bunch of peasants being paid. The last thing you actually wanted in your lodge were a bunch of grubby, dirty-handed workmen, masons. No, you want to play at this. So you've got your aprons and trowels, but they're just ritual instruments. No one uses them to build a damn thing. You're pretending. So that's the question I have. How would a genuine Masonic group of workmen transform themselves into a bunch of dilettantes who just pretended to be Masons for some kind of esoteric purpose? But there's this period. Freemasonry emerges as a major force, as a kind of growing and important fraternal order in the 18th century. A lot of people tend to think that it's created in the 18th century. It's not. So a key date is that in 1717 in London, 4 existing lodges joined together to create the Grand Lodge, a kind of overarching organization, which became the Grand Lodge of England and later the Grand Lodge of England and Wales. But that wasn't the creation of Freemasons, because there were already those 4 lodges that were already there. And they had been around, and others had been around, and there was another Grand Lodge in York that claimed even greater descent. So sometime in the early 1400s, that is about a century after the Templar Order is officially disbanded, ceases to exist as the Templars, you begin to get these documents that appear talking about these kind of pretend Masonic lodges. You get the Regius document is one of them, some others that come up, and they appear to be the kind of rule books for these groups. So somewhere between 14 and 1500, Masonic lodges, as they would later appear as oath-bound fraternal orders, begin to slowly appear. They're in a kind of small scale. And that continues for really the next 300 years. So by the time that Freemasonry becomes a big deal in the 1700s, it's already for 250 or 300 years been kind of quietly gestating in Scotland and other areas, and then sort of breaks into the big time. And this is what we really don't know, is what was going on in that 300-year period. See, if we knew the whole history of that, if we could go back and look at that evolution from the early societies to the major secret society that later appears, then maybe we could actually see the continuity between that and the Templars, or we could see that there is no continuity.
Well, those gaps is where the fun stories can be created about secret societies, because they're secret. I mean, so
you've got these, one of the guys that will be mentioned, there is in the 1730s, there is a Freemason in France by the name of the Chevalier Ramsay. I think it's Chevalier Andrew Ramsay. Now, he's actually of Scottish origin, but he's living in France. There's a whole history to that. And he'll often be cited, so people go, well, there's the whole connection between the Templars and Freemasonry was established by the Chevalier Ramsay in his address to Freemasons in, I think 1737, somewhere around there, 1730s. And of course, see, because it's on a piece of paper and he says so, that means it's the case. Well, it wouldn't, just because he said so. But the other interesting thing is if you actually read his address to Freemasons, it never mentions the Templars. It mentions we're the heirs to the Crusaders, to the Crusading Order, okay, so which would include the Templars, but not it doesn't make us, we're just kind of the heirs to the Crusaders.
Yeah, there were a lot of Crusaders, and there were a small amount of Templars, even at its height, relatively small.
There, so part of it, but the whole idea that he establishes this link is again a story which isn't true.
Right.
So it's always, I'm not trying to pop anybody's bubble in this case, but the point is that the guy who's credited with having said this never actually says it.
The inconvenient facts. That's all right. You're here to pop bubbles to an extent and create other bubbles. We have one major group, which we're not going to get to, which is those major figures, because that's way too long. But I think we sort of skipped over the Hashashins or the Assassins, and I think we can probably get that in, and then do part 2 in a few months.
Well, okay. One of the other connection, which is often brought up, is that the Knights Templar. Okay, they're a crusading order. They're in the Levant, in the Holy Land. In that whole eastern end of the Mediterranean, whatever name you want to give to it, that area.
We're Israel friendly here.
Right. That they and the Assassins, which is generally known, which are nominally a Shiite Islamic. For a period of about 200 years, they're in fairly close connection with each other. And in fact, they're pretty much in spitting distance. In what's now Lebanon, there were Templar castles sort of marking out the frontier of the Crusader states, and not too far away in those mountains, there were assassin castles, which was there. And they had a kind of alliance. They didn't really fight each other. And there is recorded interaction between them. At one point, there is because they had the same enemies in a way. So, without going too far down the rabbit hole, the major split in Islam, almost from the beginning, is between what is called Sunni or Orthodox Islam and Shia or sectarian Islam. And the issues over this is to where the bloodline goes.
Right.
See if this sounds vaguely familiar. Sunni or Orthodox Islam, which 80 to 85% of modern Muslims are a part of in one way, argues that there's the Prophet Muhammad and then there are a series of successors, which, clearly because they were the successors, was divinely ordained in this, it's like the line of popes. Not exactly. There's a certain line of popes, and this is where religious authority follows. And among those are Muhammad's cousin, almost brother, the guy he was raised of, his kind of best bud and boyhood friend, Ali. So wherever you found Muhammad early on, Ali is one of his first converts. Ali marries the Prophet's daughter. He's his son-in-law. So they're very closely related to each other. And see, so Muhammad has only sort of one surviving daughter. Ali marries her.
Right.
And this blood of the Prophet flows through the line of Ali. Now, from the beginning, there were those around the Prophet who argued that the true successor was Ali. Obviously, that's the way it should be. He's the closest to Muhammad. And they objected to the fact that on 3 occasions before him, he was passed over. He only becomes the 4th caliph, and then he's murdered. He's assassinated. And then his 2 sons are murdered. And then all of it's just a succession of murder and assassination.
Right.
And so it's a blood feud that goes back. And so Shiism believes that the true bloodline of the Prophet, bloodline again, just like the Jesus and Mary thing, similar idea, that's really the line of succession, that all the other caliphs who then followed and everything stemming from them is illegitimate. And only our line is the true one. So it's a battle over a bloodline.
So they believe in a probate court kind of thing, where if all of the direct descendants aren't there, you'd start going to cousins or nieces or nephews, and they just sense it's actually it's a monarchy as opposed to the best suited for whatever variety of reasons.
Yes, and that's where Sunni clerics argue against that, because they say it turns it into a monarchy. It turns it into a family dynasty, which Allah never intended it to be. God picked Muhammad to be his prophet just because the reason God does everything. He just decided that it was going to be that guy.
Right.
Okay? Didn't say anything about, I'm not going to start something with your cousin succeeding you. Nobody said it was that. But people argue over this. And so it is a blood feud, and Shiites were always in the minority.
If God wanted to do that, he would have had another flood and created and left it with just Noah and his family if he wanted to make a monarchy.
So it's so they've been persecuted and condemned, and so despite the fact that the Shiite Muslims didn't have that much in common with the Christians, otherwise they did have a common enemy.
Gotcha. And
that was the Sunni power structure in Egypt and others around them. They hated the same people. And there actually was recorded an offer which came from the Grand Master of the Templars to the Grand Master of they both have Grand Masters, interestingly enough, of the Assassins. They go, look, why don't we just stop this? Why don't you just kiss the cross? Okay. Why don't you all convert to Catholicism, to Christianity, and we'll all march on Damascus together. And the assassins weren't going to do that, but they would march on Damascus against them. So the Templars and the assassins did have this kind of symbiotic relationship. They had the same enemy. They have the same color scheme. So the color scheme for the Templars is red and white. What were the two prominent colors that the assassins had? White, red, and white. They were both organized as kind of monastic orders. Now, the assassins did go in for other things, which included murder for hire. There seems to have been it started out that they killed their opponents. And one of the ways they would do this, since they were a fairly small group and didn't have a large army, assassination, subversion was an important part of this. And in fact, subversion becomes a key element in Shiite survival. This is where one of the, because you're a persecuted minority, what's one of the ways that you can survive? Well, one of the ways that you survive is that you deny who you are. So one of the things that was permissible widely, not universally, but widely within Shiism, which also is divided into many subsects, was the doctrine of concealment. And the doctrine of concealment was that in order to protect yourself and your faith, you could deny Ali. You could say that, I never believed in Ali, he's a complete fake. You could badmouth him in public all you wanted to, but so long as you knew deep down that he was the true Khalif, that he was the true successor, and that all the lines of the Imams, the kind of holy leaders, ran through him, that was okay. God wouldn't fault you for that. So outwardly, you could pretend to be one thing, while inwardly, you were something else. And that was the kind of secretive, subversive element within it. And that's one of the things that the assassins sort of took and put on steroids. And their idea was that you could actually achieve more through the selective murder of opposing Sunni rulers than you could by confronting them openly. Over time, it appears that the sect gradually degenerated to the point where they simply became, where the business of killing, which they became quite adept at, became just that. It became a business. Right. And it began to lose its... And that's a progression which is fairly understandable. Now, there's a scholar by the name of Idris Shah, not his real name, but that's what he wrote under. And I think in his work on secret societies, which is informative. I wouldn't argue that it's always absolutely accurate, but I don't know who is. But he has his point of view. He makes the interesting proposal, without really elaborating it that much, that the assassins and the Templars were more than just neighbors and alike, that they were the same order under two different regimes. That the Templars were simply the Christian version of this organization. They were how it operated in Christendom. And the assassins were how it operated in the Islamic realm. But they both recognize this commonality between them. They're the same sort of company operating under different forms. It's an intriguing idea, and certainly that would explain. It's a story that explains the similarities between them. And, well, it's not something that I would endorse. I'm not going to jump on that and say, yeah, that's true. That's the story I would go for. I'd say it's an interesting story to keep in mind, and there's probably something to that to one degree or another. That's really about as far as you can push. I mean, this is the thing you have to acknowledge. When you look at this stuff, you go, hey, there's something going on here. These similarities are too. They're not just accidental. It's that old rule, that one time is an accident, twice is a coincidence, three times is enemy action. Okay, three times something's going on. You should really pay attention to it.
Well, it was also practice for the Templars later on when they rebranded as the Knights of Malta, or the Cross of Christ, or whatever the group in Portugal was, and so rebranding, was
to become or the idea that you become these lay, Masonic orders. Templars.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, the idea of concealment.
I like it.
So see, it's a good story.
It is a good story. Where does Baphomet fill into this story? Like Baphomet, the goat, the upside down pentagram. Okay. Maybe he's the devil. Maybe it was just a mistranslation of the word. Muhammad is, and then I think that we're going to let you go.
Well, Baphomet is, all right, you got the image of Baphomet today. The thing that the Satanists, or some Satanists have now borrowed as an image for their god, because, right. I don't know, I guess they thought the regular one looked too cartoonish. Okay, they want to get away from the Anton LaVey thing.
Right.
Plastic horns.
Yes.
So, the image of the hermaphroditic goat god, or whatever you want to call it, it has nothing to do with the Templars. Okay, the Templars, they mentioned Baphomet. This was supposedly some sort of image that they venerated. They would always say, we don't worship, we just venerate it, which I think is kind of a, slightly chicken shit way of saying you do worship it, but we won't say that. And they never give a straightforward description of it. If you look through the testimony that was given among the relatively few Templars that were ever asked about this, usually the description they give is some sort of head. And it might have been, those things weren't unusual. Heads were often, they could be a golden head. Sometimes it was an actual head, a skull inside some sort of golden outer work. And in other cases, somebody said it was the image of a woman. I think someone else said it was a cat. I don't know. Maybe it was all of those things. Maybe it was like a woman cat head. In other words, you get no coherent description, but never does anybody in the Templar disposition say, it was a hermaphroditic goat man. Okay, no. The image of Baphomet is a creation in the early 19th century by Louis Constant, a French occultist, former Catholic seminarian, what else, who mostly wrote under the name of Eliphas Levi.
Uh-huh.
Okay, and he was he wrote the doctrines, the Dogma and Doctrines of High Magic. He was a very important guy in sort of this occult revival, and he based that on descriptions that he had gotten from talking to French, largely witches, people who had carried on these kind of folk traditions. And that's where, and there's a similarity between that and an Egyptian deity called the Goat of Mendes, which was also a kind of fertility god, but there's no real necessary connection. Look, goats have impressed humans for centuries as being particularly horny little creatures. Mm-hmm. Okay? That's, okay, horny as a goat. We recognize that. So it wasn't unusual for them to be connected to fertility. But the image, the drawing, and if you look down at the bottom of it, it's got his name. He autographed it. That's his rendition in the 19th century of something that was described to him by French rural practitioners of magic. And what this is very similar to are the descriptions you get from witch trials about the presiding deity or costume figure who would preside over coven meetings. And they're often dressed up as a goat. And that's what they're trying to represent. So that image is based in European witchcraft. It has nothing in particular to do with the Templars, and then Baphomet, a term which nobody knows what that term means. Nobody ever explained it. And, it sounds, Baphomet, it's got Met at the end, so it must be some kind of version of Muhammad. Well, that's the whole reasoning. It sounds vaguely similar, so there's got to be a connection. Well, maybe not. So you don't know what the term, Crowley had a different version of what this word might actually have meant. And it provides the material for so many stories, because remember, what we want more than anything else as human beings is we want things explained.
Exactly.
Okay, it's like you go to a movie You ever gone to a movie and you come out of the movie and you go, I don't understand it.
Yes.
I don't know what it's like David Lynch. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Mulholland Drive. Mulholland Drive, yes, fascinates some people and frustrates others because you can't figure out what the hell you just saw. And we don't like that. Okay? We want to have, remember, we want to have the story to have an arc. We want the characters to have an arc, and we want there to be resolution. We want it explained. We don't want a bunch of stuff that will appear and then we can't figure out what's going on.
Well, that's why I want you to actually have a second podcast, or do this as a series in your existing podcast called The End is Always Nigh, because the end is always nigh, or the end is always near. And because right now there's a lot of people who really think that we are in end times. And there's always been a lot of people who always think we're in end times. Yeah. So, I don't know. Anyway, that's it's just like me to give people more work to do with that without any promise of compensation for it. So then there I go again. So Baphomet, another one of those things where just popped out of nowhere. It's been retrofitted into something that has no relationship with, and it's a word that some guy probably invented. I mean, it sounds more like Baphomet to me. Does that mean it's the god of the shower?
Could be. Bassinet.
Ooh, Bassinet. That's a good one, too.
There you go.
The god of baby. Well, fertility, baby's the goat. It's all coming together now. So
you can get Baphomet plush toys for your children or grandchildren.
I'm sure that there is a very niche customer base for it.
I did once threaten to get that for one of my grandchildren. It didn't go over that well, but I may do it anyway.
Okay.
Just going to do it.
Yeah, well, there you go. It seems like an episode of Evil, which, by the way, is a fantastic show. All right. So we're going to, I think we should stop there for the time. And if you're kind enough, we'll start with some of the other figures that I mentioned, but it sounds like there's others that, sort of help bridge those lines, and we'll coordinate after I drop the show. But in the meantime, you get a second chance now to plug whatever it is that you're doing. But before that, I'm going to ask you, is there any song that comes to your mind right now that this conversation has inspired? An outro, preferably under 5 minutes.
Any song that comes to mind?
Yep.
No. I can sit here and think about them now. And songs haven't been jumping to my mind in this case.
Well, they have to. You're doing the occult and rock and roll, so.
We were talking about the Beatles earlier, and one of the things that did Eleanor Rigby. Okay. I don't know what that means.
So I don't either. Doesn't matter. It's guest privilege.
A Day in the Life. That might have been it. But no, nothing that jumps to mind.
Nothing at all. Okay, well, I'll come up with something. It'll probably be like Ronnie James Dio or something, just because I'm always looking for an excuse to do Dio. So
yeah. Well, there's always the Stones' Sympathy for the Devil. You can always have that. It always works in a pinch. So, So to recap, you can find the main things that I've done. You can find on the Great Courses website, or if you are already a subscriber to Amazon Prime. If you scroll through that, you'll probably come through the Great Courses Signature Collection, which at various times has had my series on the real history of secret societies, where we talk about a lot of things. We talk, Templars are in there, Freemasons are in there, Illuminati, and others. But those are kind of the big three. And the Secrets of the Occult, I believe, is certainly on that now. And also Crimes of the Century, which is another series that I did, which in some ways is almost kind of my favorite at some point, but that is a survey of various historical homicides of various kinds and different times and places. There are also a couple of other sort of ensemble series that were done for Great Courses, Wondrium, as it was also called for a while. One is Secrets of Espionage, where I sort of appear along some other people. And then also was one on forensic history, decoding the evidence, where again, sort of looking at some historical murders. I've do lots of interviews. So if you go to YouTube, he could disturbingly probably find me in a lot of things, saying things that I would generally stand by. Never know. And then, of course, if you're interested, I said flog this dog. Look for Strange as It Seems. We just recorded another episode yesterday about Jack Parsons. And the big question being whether or not Jack Parsons, JPL rocket scientist, was also a spy. So, maybe. So if you're intrigued by that, you might, when that episode comes in. But we've got others about everything from the weaponization of magic to James Shelby Downard. And if you don't know who he is, watch the episode and you'll see. There's another one on Fred Chrisman and more besides, and we'll continue those. My books, the one that I seem to have been most connected with is Secret Agent 666, Aleister Crowley, British Intelligence and the Occult.
Oh, yeah.
You can find that on Amazon. There's also my biography of Sidney Riley and His World, early 20th century spy, Trust No One, The Secret World of Sidney Riley. And then also, if you're just into more like economic conspiracy and skullduggery, and you like the Russian Revolution, we've got Wall Street and the Russian Revolution, 1905 to 1925, and those are the main ones.
That sounds like a lot. That sounds like a good amount. All right. Thank you very much. Is Professor Richard Spence. You've heard where you can find him and where you can support him or where you can buy his stuff. And some of it, every now and then, is included in memberships, not just Amazon Prime, but also Audible and other places as well.
There are freebies that come up. So
there are. Now they lock you in. They don't lock you in, but they sort of hook you into others, and that's fine. It's it's like crack that's good for your brain. So and by the way, kids, regular crack is not good for any part of you. Now, crackle candy bars we talked about that at the beginning. It's reasonable minds can differ. All right. Richard Spence, thank you. We'll hopefully have you again, and we'll talk about some of these names of people as opposed to names of groups. Thank you all for listening. If you are here by accident or you're a fan of Professor Spence for the first time, just subscribe to Garden of Doom, or it might be Garden of Thoughts now, and you'll get the Thought Singular, and you'll get 3 shows. That one, whatever the title is, Garden Views, and God Presents the Book of Black, which also might shares with the Gospel of Thomas. And Garden Views is sort of like this kind of variety, but more law, business, realpolitik, science, technology, and then things like that, interesting conversations with interesting people. And God Presents the Book of Black / Gospel of Thomas is with my co-host, either PJ Black or Mr. Thomas. They are both professional wrestlers with more than 2 decades, and we talk to people about non-wrestling things sort of in this tapestry. And some of our guests have included former world champion to actually Impact heavyweight champion and NWA world champion EC3, and former NWA world heavyweight champion Tyrus, who, yes, you know him from Fox News and all that other good stuff and other stuff too. And hopefully that'll continue. So, and of course, my favorite, just because the name is fantastic, Super Panda. What's not fantastic about Super Panda? All right. Thank you, Professor Spence. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Next time you'll hear a song. I'm not sure what it'll be yet, but you'll hear it in real time.
T-shirt, stupid bloody Tuesday, man, you've been a naughty boy. Yes, boy, you've been a naughty girl, you let your knickers down. I am the Eggman. They are the Eggmen. I am the Walrus. Cuckoo-cuckoo. Sitting in an English garden, waiting for the sun. If the sun don't come, you get the jam from standing in the English rain. I am the Eggman. They are the Eggmen. I am the Walrus. Expert, choking smokers. Don't you think the Joker laughs at you? See how we smile like pigs in a sky. See how we snide. I'm crying. Semolina Pilcher. Climbing up the Eiffel Tower. Coronation Penguin singing Hare Krishna. You should have seen the gift connector on the cover. I am the Eggman. I am the Eggman. I am the Walrus.
The letters is find stuff I think to Edmund Earl He's united on the British Party. Oh, untimely death.
Serviceable villain. Dubious to the vices of my history.